I was beat. The 12-hour flight from Tokyo was always an ordeal, and it didn't get any easier as I got older. Even with one of those berth seats in first class on the big 777, there wasn't much sleeping for me. I hated flying, not because I was afraid. No, just because of the sheer drudgery of it, especially the trans-Pacific routes that took me to my customers in Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. For a change, Beatrix had agreed to pick me up. She hated driving from our home in Piedmont in the East Bay to San Francisco International. I didn't know if it was me or the drive she found onerous, but things were going to come to a head in our marriage soon. Over the last couple of years, she had become a stranger to me. As her drinking increased, my pleas for her to get treatment not only fell on deaf ears, but usually invoked an outburst, actually more than an outburst, usually a scathing verbal attack where she told me to mind my own business. I tried to explain that our marriage was my business, but to no avail. I hadn't told her why I insisted she pick me up, but she grudgingly agreed, reminding me that the BART train home was faster and more convenient. Maybe for her it was, but after traveling for many hours, a seat in her big Mercedes was much preferable to the seats on the train. Anyway, I wanted her full attention, and I also knew she would not be drinking if she was going to be driving, so at least at the start of our conversation she would be sober. But now it was 7:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, and I was on the first train of the day from San Francisco International. Beatrix and I had arranged to meet when my flight arrived Sunday evening, but my business wrapped up early in Taipei, and I snagged a seat on an earlier connecting flight out of Tokyo. Must have called Beatrix half a dozen times before I left Tokyo, but there was no answer at our home or from her cell. I was going to arrive about 12 hours early, which put me into San Francisco about 6 on Sunday morning. Even if I reached her, I figured it was highly unlikely I could convince her to get up that early to meet me. With no answer, all kinds of thoughts went through my head. Had she finally just packed up and left? Unlikely, but if she had, did I care? I knew I did care. We'd been married for over 20 years and had 2 wonderful children. I'd loved her ever since we were kids when we lived across the street from each other. We grew up together and shared the discovery of many joys of life. She had also introduced me to crushing heartbreak. I grimaced as I thought about how, during our junior year at Berkeley High, she had abandoned me. I was just a math and science geek, and she had become an in-crowd cheerleader. We both grew up a lot during the 6 years we were separated. I hated it, but I learned I could live without her. I was now convinced that I was going to find out if I could do it again. Beatrix's alcoholism has worsened over the last few months, especially since our son Brady left for college. Dad, you've got to get her some help. I know she's drinking a lot, but I've seen her taking all sorts of pills. I told her not to expect me back home. I love you both, but I can't take her abuse and the disrespect she shows you. I just can't. He gently chided me for being gone so much, but told me he understood. I'm worried about her, Dad. I want my mother back. I hugged Brady and promised to see if there was any way I could get her into treatment. So far, I had been rebuffed. It was my intention to tell her today that I was divorcing her. I didn't intend to tell her it was treatment or a divorce, because I knew she would dig in her heels about that. No, I was just going to tell her I was throwing in the towel and that it was obvious whatever we once had was gone. This saddened me greatly. Maybe once I moved out and started the divorce, she would come to her senses. Alcohol was a powerful drug, but I knew my Beatrix could beat it. I just couldn't figure out what started her down this self-destructive path and why she refused to get help. Did she despise me so much? So there I was, sifting through the Sunday Chronicle, having the train car almost to myself at that early hour. I paid little attention to the stops as the train moved under the city. I barely registered the driver's announcement of Embarcadero Station when I heard the click-clack of high heels on the marble platform in the deserted station. I love women in heels and peeked over the top of the paper as she entered the door at the other end of the car. My heart skipped and my stomach lurched when I recognized the woman as Beatrix. At that point, what she was wearing made its way into my confused and jet-lagged brain. She's dressed like a slut. She had on a sheer white sleeveless sweater without a bra. Her dark pink nipples were prominent. Below the sweater was a red leather skirt that did nothing to cover the reinforced stocking tops of the dark hose she wore. I could easily see the silver color of the suspender clips. On her feet were incredibly high red patent leather pumps with stiletto heels. Her auburn hair was disheveled and there were runs in her stockings. She sat with her head down, doing nothing to hide the tears that streaked her cheeks. She shivered. I lowered the paper and examined her more fully. She took no notice of me. My Beatrix looked like a street hooker on her way home from a rough night. She pulled a dark leather jacket from the large leather tote she carried and pulled it around her shoulders. I watched her, mesmerized. Part of me wanted to go to her and comfort her, and part of me that was enraged wanted to go to her, shake her and force answers from her about what she'd been doing. It was my turn to shiver as a horrible sick feeling made its way through my body. How long has this been going on? Did she have one lover? Or had she descended to the point she was turning tricks in hotels in San Francisco? As the train raced under San Francisco Bay, her sobs increased. She made no effort to stifle her misery. We were alone in the car, and she still hadn't noticed me sitting 20 feet away. I pulled out my phone, and as we came into the daylight of the West Oakland station, I took several photos. What had happened to her, to us? Why was she doing this? I knew when we got home I would confront her. I didn't know where I was going to go, but I vowed to pack up today and move out. Drinking was one thing, but this obvious infidelity hell, whoring more like it, was the final indignity. My heart was breaking for what we had and what she was throwing away. My sadness threatened to overwhelm me. I had only 4 more stops to think what I would do. I knew it was futile to confront her on the train or in the station. Hell, I'd probably get arrested. No, I'd follow her home and confront her there. Now it wasn't a matter of threatening divorce. Threats had been overcome by events. Divorce was a certainty. As soon as her back was to me, I grabbed my carry-on bag and left through the forward door just as it started to close. I watched her walk slowly down the now sun-drenched platform, her head down. She produced a handkerchief and wiped her tears. My beautiful Beatrix, my wife, the woman I loved, looked as miserable as anyone I had ever seen. I was devastated. Following about 20 feet behind her as she walked down the stairs from the platform, I doubted she would have noticed me had I been right beside her. She fumbled for a few moments in the large tote until she found a small purse, and she pulled out her BART ticket and made her way through the turnstile. I followed her down the escalator and into the parking lot as she made her way to her new silver Mercedes S-Class. I photographed her as she opened the car, got in and drove away. I headed across College Avenue to the other parking lot and then realized to my chagrin I didn't have a car at the station. My car was at the dealer for servicing, and they had dropped me off at the train station for my outbound flight, promising to bring it to my home after the work was done. I stood in the sun on this bright Sunday morning and looked for a taxi, without success. I mentally shrugged, put the strap of my bag on my shoulder, and started walking the 2 miles home. Fortunately, I had dressed casually on my return. Polo shirt, khaki dockers, a silk and cotton sport coat, and comfortable shoes. As I walked, I passed several benches and thought of just sitting and thinking, but I knew it was time for me to get home and face her. Delay would not make things better. After about 10 minutes I realized, what would Brady and Connie say? Brady seemed to know our marriage was in peril. Connie had been at college most of the last 4 years, although she had to have picked up on the tension in the household and her mother's drinking during her short visits home. I really didn't think she'd be surprised. After about 40 minutes I climbed the hill to our house, the exercise warming my cramped muscles. We had lived there more than a dozen years, most of them happy. I recalled how excited Beatrix was when we decided to buy the home. It was 2-story stucco Mediterranean style, with a huge kitchen and a large master bedroom upstairs that contained an enormous sunken tub and a shower for 2. I thought of our first weekend in the house and how we made love in both places. Now our dreams were ashes. I fished my keys out of the pocket of my sport coat. The house was silent as I walked through the main level to the kitchen. The house was spotless, as usual. Between Beatrix's demand for cleaning perfection and a cleaning person every week, it usually had the look of an impending photo shoot for Sunset magazine. Even drunk, Beatrix cleaned and scrubbed. I did notice a glass and an empty bottle of scotch in the sink. That was unusual. I headed up the stairs calling Beatrix's name. I didn't want her to be startled, although God knows what kind of condition I'd find her in. I fully expected that she'd have changed her clothes and showered and might actually be asleep in our king-size bed. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. I pushed open the double doors to our bedroom, softly calling her name in case she was asleep. I had decided if she was in bed, I would just leave her there and talk to her later. There was no sign of her, although her whore clothes were strewn about the floor. That was also unlike Beatrix. Somehow my muddled brain noticed there were no panties amidst the garments. Through the door to the bathroom I heard a song from Beatrix's favorite album, Something by Sarah McLachlan. I found her music a bit too syrupy, but Beatrix loved to listen while in her bath and in her car. I started to turn the knob when Beatrix's phone beeped indicating a message. The sound came from the small purse on the dresser. At that point I noticed the mirror and the used lines of what I suspected was cocaine. There was also a small mound of cocaine on the mirror. I wondered if it was for after her bath. Next to the mirror was a plastic sandwich bag filled with white powder. It looked like a huge amount. Where would she get that much cocaine? It must have cost a fortune. Was she feeding her habit by trading sex for drugs? Oh, Beatrix. The phone beeped again. I pulled the phone from her purse and flipped it open and saw several missed calls, all from the same San Francisco number. I went to her voicemail and put in her password. It had always been the same, our daughter's birthday. Beatrix, baby, where'd you go? We're still having a party here. Call me. The voice was slightly slurred, but I thought it sounded familiar. I listened to the next message. Beatrix, enough fun, baby. You need to get back here. You know the deal. No more candy for baby, unless you play. You better come back soon. That time I recognized the voice as one of the partners in Beatrix's firm. His name was Cole Harvey. The next message was much more strident and demanding. Beatrix, God damn it, get you ass back here right now. We're not done playing. If you're not back here in the next 10 minutes, all the photos will go to your limpdick husband. You wouldn't want him to find out what a cock-loving slut you are, would you? Anyway, you know you love it. Wait a second. Mark says he needs you back, 'cause he knows you want some more of his big black cock. I didn't listen to the next message. I had heard enough. Beatrix had somehow gotten involved with Cole and she was using cocaine, apparently supplied by Cole. I was also sickened by the thought that Mark Lamont was involved. While Cole had always seemed a bit oily, Mark seemed a decent family man. But now this. I leaned against the door hearing the quiet and now almost mournful singing and knew it was past time to confront Beatrix. My hands trembled in fury as I opened the door. Why? I stepped into the bathroom fully expecting to hear a shriek of surprise or some kind of response from Beatrix. Instead, she was just lying there in a bubble bath, a serene smile on her face. An empty bottle of champagne was lying on its side near the tub. Nearby, on the floor, was an amber pill container. It also was on its side, empty. I went to her and shook her, furious, wanting to wake her and ask why had she done this? I wanted her to tell me. I still had her phone in my hand and I called 911. Beatrix was unresponsive. Suddenly all my rage evaporated as fear for Beatrix set in. I drained the cooling water from the tub and lifted her out while wrapping her in a large towel. She was so thin I hardly recognized her body. She seemed to weigh nothing as I carried her to our bed. Beatrix had always kept herself in shape with diet and exercise, but for years she still had plenty of womanly curves on her tall frame. Now she was ice cold as I hugged her to me. I took her to the bed and covered her with the blankets. Her pulse was very slow and her breathing shallow. I knew I would have to act fast if she stopped breathing. Please, Beatrix, please don't die. Please don't do this to us. I lay close with my arms around her, trying to give her some of my warmth. With great reluctance I did leave her for a few moments to hide the bag of cocaine and open the front door. I left the remainder of the cocaine on the mirror. I knew the medical people would need to know what she had taken. I looked at the pill container as I listened to the fast approaching siren. The pill bottle said it should contain 20 pills, and the date on the label showed it was purchased a week ago. The fear of losing Beatrix, fear of being without my wife and lover and my friend, turned my stomach in knots. Despite what we had been through the last couple of years, I never considered letting her die. I knew I still loved her with all my heart and I wanted desperately for her to live. I also knew there would be a reckoning for those responsible. I heard the aid car pull up and then doors slamming and footsteps. I called down to them. I didn't want to let her go. I feared this would be the last time I would hold her. The two young men and a pretty blonde woman gently took her from me, uncovered her, and stretched her out on the bed. She looked so pale and emaciated. She was naked and I was embarrassed for her that these strangers would see her like that. I was also ashamed that I had failed her, failed to get help for her, failed to notice how she had changed physically. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen her naked or when we last made love. As they quickly began to work on her, a second woman appeared. She gently pulled me from the room and out into the hallway. I told her about coming home and finding her in the bath. I gave her the pill bottle and pointed through the door at the cocaine on the dresser. I also told her about the bottle of champagne in the bathroom next to the tub, and the bottle in the sink downstairs. She left me there and quickly moved into the bedroom to brief the other three. From that point until hours later at the hospital, my memory was a blur. I remember them taking her out on a stretcher/gurney and that one of the men was using a bag to breathe for her. She had tubes in her and was covered with a large blanket. Somehow I was glad no one could see her nakedness now. There was no room for me in the aid car. I followed in her car, and by the time I parked she had been swallowed up in the emergency department. I vaguely remembered a nice young woman helping me through all the hospital and insurance forms, and then talking to a policeman. I knew that any time a spouse ends up dead or in the hospital, the other spouse is automatically a suspect. I told him I had just gotten home from a 2-week trip to Asia and had come home and found her. I didn't think there was any reason to tell him about seeing her on the train. He asked if we were having marital difficulties. I told him the truth. After a while he left me alone. I was sure he would talk to the ER docs before getting back to me. Somehow I did manage to get hold of Connie and Brady. I didn't give them many details other than she was very ill and was in the emergency room. They both promised to get there soon. "Mr. Marshall?" The voice sounded like it came from far away as I sat on the hard waiting room chair. I didn't know how long I'd been there. Eventually I looked up and saw a young man in green scrubs. "Mr. Marshall?" I nodded, trying to gauge his expression. Was he there to tell me Beatrix had died? "Will you come with me, please?" I stood on shaky legs as he indicated a small office nearby. I shook my head as he offered coffee. "Mr. Marshall, your wife is out of danger." I didn't hear the rest of the sentence as I put my face in my hands and cried. He left me alone for a few minutes. Finally I felt a hand on my back. "Mr. Marshall, I'm Dr. Norman." The younger man had been replaced by an older man, also dressed in green scrubs. "Are you okay enough to talk now?" I looked at him and could only nod. He handed me a glass of water. I drank it gratefully. "Thanks. Mr. Marshall, I know it is very difficult when a spouse tries to take her own life, but just know that she will probably make a full physical recovery. She is very thin and dehydrated. She had a huge quantity of alcohol in her system, the sleeping pills, and of course the cocaine. In a strange way, the cocaine may have saved her from the immediate effects of the pills she took. The medics did a great job in not waiting to pump her stomach. If you had waited to call for help, maybe even 5 minutes, she might not have made it. "Can I see her?" "Yes, but she's still out, and maybe for a few days." My whole body ached from lack of sleep and the fact that the adrenaline that coursed through my body had done its work and now left me drained. My legs felt like lead as I made my way to the intensive care unit. I trembled as I looked at her. She was very pale and her hair was tucked under a surgical cap. She hardly looked at all like my Beatrix, my sweet love, the mother of our children and my lifelong friend. The heart monitor showed a steady but slow beat. They told me she was on the ventilator just as a precaution, and once her breathing stabilized, they'd take her off. "Beatrix, please don't die," I whispered. The ICU nurse finally ushered me out and I found myself in the Sunday morning quiet hospital cafeteria. I was exhausted, but my mind refused to shut down. I knew I needed to sleep, but that had to wait. I poured myself a cup of thick black coffee and poured cream and sugar in it. I took my coffee black, but today I needed the extras. I sat in the hard cafeteria chair and thought about the years we had been together and the events that lead up to Beatrix's suicide attempt. Actually, there was no attempt about it. I didn't know much about the pathology that causes people to take their own lives, but something stuck in my mind that many people who attempt suicide are crying out for help. That was not the case with Beatrix. With both Brady and Connie away in school and with me not expected for another 12 hours, Beatrix was not crying out for help. She had been determined to kill herself, knowing that no one would find her until I got home that night. I shuddered at the thought of that scene. No Beatrix at the airport, making my way home and finding her dead in the bath. It was a near enough thing as it was. What if I had decided to sit on one of those benches for even a few minutes? I could have prevented the whole thing if I had been man enough to confront her on the train or at the station, or without my stupid pride if I'd been able to go to her, comfort her and hold her, and let her know things would be all right. No, I sat and watched as she fell apart in front of me. I should have known I was seeing the woman I loved reaching the end of her rope. Now Beatrix was upstairs unconscious and the fault was partially mine. I ignored her and abandoned her as her drinking got worse. Yes, she did everything she could to drive me away, but I was her husband, sickness and Heath and all that. Was I looking for her to hurt me again as she had done years before? Was that why I always held back just a bit? Was it a defense mechanism? I did love her, and I relished the many happy years we had together. Could we ever put Humpty Dumpty together again? I didn't know. I shook myself loose from these thoughts and forced myself to drink the now cold coffee. I made a decision, now it was time to go. I had things to do and people to call and actions to take. Actions I hoped would lead to retribution against those who had hurt my Beatrix and destroyed my marriage. I had maybe 4 hours before Brady and Connie arrived. I got up and gazed around the empty cafeteria as I pulled out my cell phone and walked outside. It rang once and then I heard a familiar voice. What's up? I need access to a building. Where? Hers. Is she okay? No, but she'll recover. What'll you need? A prox with a blanker and a 23. You got it. How much time do I have? I'll be there in about an hour. Okay. Stop and buy a Chronicle across the street. Thanks. I owe you. No, you don't. Thanks anyway. Okay, man. I hope she gets better soon. He hung up. Our phones used encryption technology, but still we kept our conversations short. I was going to pay a visit to the law offices of Madison and Trasker. The phone call had been to a longtime friend who spent most of his life on the other side of the law. We were kind of the yin and yang of the computer security business. I had ordered a proximity badge that would get me access to Beatrix's building in San Francisco and all the offices. The badge would have my photo on it and look real to anyone. It also had a built-in blanker, which would temporarily blind the security cameras as I went through the building. Anyone who was watching the monitors would see it as a momentary computer glitch that caused a loss of the video feed from that camera. I also knew there was typically only one person on duty in the One Market building on Sunday mornings, and the chance he or she would even think twice about a blip of the cameras was remote, even if the security guard was anywhere near the monitors. The 23 was another thing altogether. It was a computer virus he and I developed. After I downloaded everything from Cole Harvey and Mark Lamont computers, I was going to infect them with a nasty virus that would destroy everything on them beyond recovery. No one would ever know I had even been there. If anyone had the knowledge to try to trace the bug, it would seem to come from a porn site outside the country. I might do the same for Beatrix's computer, depending on what I found there. Hell, I might bring down every server at the law firm. I turned up my collar and ran across the street from the hospital to the parking garage. I had a train to catch. I was going back to Embarcadero Station. The morning sun had given way to winter darkness and heavy rain. Fit my mood. After the divorce and investigation, Beatrix stopped her nervous pacing and looked at the sweeping view of San Francisco Bay from her 20th floor apartment. It was almost noon and a postcard summer day in the Bay Area. She watched a container ship, with a small white splash at its bow, head toward the Golden Gate. She had watched so many of them over the last 6 months, and each time she wished that she could be on one of them, sailing away from her problems and the memories that haunted her. She didn't know where they were headed, but she knew it had to be better than this velvet prison. Today was her last day in the Redwood, an exclusive and very expensive drug and alcohol rehab facility located in a new high-rise near the waterfront. There were all the amenities of a 5-star hotel, including an excellent restaurant, room service, a shopping arcade where you could buy Fendi or Prada, lushly appointed suites, a 24-hour concierge, and a gym and salon that rivaled the fanciest health club. It also had a fully staffed health clinic and one other detail: you couldn't check out or even leave for a short while without your doctor's permission. The Redwood was also incredibly expensive. Beatrix looked around the sun-drenched living room, her eyes coming to rest on her reflection in the large mirror over the fireplace. She saw an attractive, tall and slim 45-year-old woman, perfectly dressed in an expensive short-sleeve cream silk blouse and a light peach cotton skirt which came to her knees. Her legs were tanned and toned from the gym and salon and needed no stockings. On her feet was her latest purchase, a pair of outrageously expensive Jimmy Choo high-heeled sandals. Her auburn hair fell loosely to her shoulders. She watched herself. Her deep green eyes showed none of the sparkle they had just a few years before. The sadness in them could not be denied. She knew she would leave without regret, even though this place had helped her sort out her life, which had come to a screeching halt 7 months ago when she had tried her best to kill herself. It was an act of desperation, and there was no attempt about it. She wanted to end her life, and had it not been for Sterling, her husband, early arrival, well, she didn't need to think about that. She needed to get on with her life without Sterling. With that act, she lost the only man she ever loved. No, that wasn't right, she thought. It wasn't the suicide that drove Sterling away, but her affair with Cole Moline. It wasn't really an affair. Cole just fucked her, and in exchange she got drugs and the degradation she seemed to crave. She stopped pacing and sat in one of the leather wingback chairs and stared at the deep blue water, the sun glinting on the almost flat surface. The ship was now almost to the bridge. She shook her head slowly. The affair wasn't what drove Sterling away. It was just the final act that drove a stake through the heart of their marriage. She and Dr. Hannah had been through this several times. Beatrix's drug and alcohol abuse, and her refusal to listen to Sterling and her children, had turned Beatrix into a person she didn't recognize. Instead of the smiling and happy mother, wife, and paralegal at a top law firm in the city, she'd become a screaming harridan who drove everyone away, and whose depression and self-loathing caused her to enter into risky and self-destructive behavior. No, it wasn't the affair that killed their marriage. It was the 2.5 years that preceded it. She drove her husband away with paranoia, unfounded jealousy, and withholding of intimacy. Staring at the water, Beatrix reflected as she waited for her daughter. Connie, her oldest, had stuck by her throughout. She had been off to college at UC Santa Barbara and missed the worst of Beatrix's self-destruction and abuse. On the other hand, her son Brady spent his high school years ducking her jibes and trying to avoid her drug and alcohol-fueled tirades. It seemed like it was only days after he left for college that Beatrix started her affair with Cole. Brady's leave-taking had followed an argument where he had finally let her have it. He told her that he was happy to be leaving, and if it was up to him, he would never see her again. He berated her for her awful treatment of his father. Why do you think he's gone all the time? Do you think he's got a girlfriend? You know better than that. He loves you more than you'll ever realize. But what you're doing to yourself, and him, is destroying your marriage. I'm glad I'm getting out now so I don't have to watch the end of it all. He said his goodbye so sadly it pierced her heart. She cried for hours after he left, but at that point she was too far gone to help herself. The next day at work, one of the partners, Cole Moline, caught her mood and suggested he had just the thing. The cocaine was, in fact, just the thing, and all her feelings of depression and loss blew away. Soon she was hooked, and when Cole suggested a way she could earn more drugs by letting him have sex with her, she gladly allowed herself to be escorted to the Hyatt Regency across the street for an afternoon of drug-heightened sex. Cole was not a wonderful, caring lover like her Sterling. He was rough and treated her like a whore. Beatrix responded like a wild woman. She convinced herself the sex was the best she ever had, and her rough treatment at the hands of Cole reinforced her sense of self-loathing. She also convinced herself she deserved to be treated like a whore. Today Connie was coming to take her to her new home in the East Bay. It was in El Cerrito, just north of Berkeley, on top of a hill. The view of San Francisco Bay was spectacular, and the house was on a secluded street. It cost a fortune, but with the money from the sale of the family home, the settlement from the law firm, plus Sterling's generous divorce settlement, she didn't have to worry about money. Actually, she would never have to worry about money again. She smiled ruefully. She had never worried much about money after the first few years of marriage, as Sterling's computer systems consulting business took off. She went back to work simply out of boredom as her children got older. As a paralegal, she felt needed, and it gave her a tremendous sense of self-worth to be connected to a prestigious San Francisco law firm. Connie had graduated the month before, and Beatrix was able to get permission from Dr. Hannah to travel to Santa Barbara for the ceremony. She knew Sterling would be there, so she worked hard to look her very best. She dressed in a green silk blouse that accentuated her breasts, a skirt that came just to her knees, and very high-heeled sandals that made her tanned legs look even longer. She was pleased to see how her face and figure still turned heads, but she was crushed when she saw the sadness in Sterling's eyes as they sat together at the graduation. He was a very handsome man, and he looked younger than his 45 years. He ran and swam, played golf and tennis, and at 6'1" and perhaps 185 pounds, he exuded a quite take-charge confidence that made him very successful. She was proud to be with him and enjoyed the envious stares she got from other women. It was too bad it was all a sham. She was certain Sterling no longer loved her. How had things come to this? She knew there was little chance of reconciliation. Sadly, she knew there would almost certainly be another Mrs. Marshall. Sterling was too good a man, and with his blonde hair and soft gray eyes he was irresistible. During her drug and alcohol-infused days she convinced herself he was having an affair, but she knew now that was only an excuse to cover the guilt of her own transgressions. At the graduation she managed to hold herself together as they made small talk, despite her inner hurt and feelings of loss. He had been very solicitous as always, as he had been during her recovery, but the love was gone. He had made it clear early on that her betrayal of him and the family made it unlikely they would ever live together again as husband and wife. While she was still in the hospital she begged him to forgive her and give her another chance, but it was like waves crashing against rock. He was so filled with the pain of her betrayal that he couldn't see how that could ever work. She sat there in an audience of proud parents and relatives with a false smile on her face, lost in thought. Soon the final speaker finished and the graduates began to cross the sunny platform to receive their diplomas. When Connie took hers she held it aloft, and despite everything, Beatrix hugged Sterling. She was bursting with joy as their oldest child walked down the steps, her smile radiant. Beatrix felt Sterling yield and hug her back. Her heart leapt, and just as quickly fell, as she felt him stiffen and release her. She continued to smile at their daughter as tears fell. At least for a moment she had felt the old, caring Sterling, the Sterling who had loved her for so long. Maybe there was hope. She and Sterling stood and chatted for a little while after the ceremony as they waited for Connie to reappear. Beatrix was surprised to learn that Sterling was taking flying lessons. She knew he had always dreamed of being a pilot, and she watched him smile as he talked about the complexities of dealing with the 3 dimensions of flying. They both seemed relieved when Connie finally rejoined them. She was bubbling with excitement about the graduation and the fact she was going to start law school in Berkeley in the fall. Beatrix was pleased that Connie was going to be living with her, at least for the time being. "I know Dad still loves you." Connie's voice trailed off as her mother dabbed tear-filled eyes. They drove silently along Highway 1 for a few miles, enjoying the sun and beauty of coastal California as they traveled north to San Francisco. Beatrix looked at her beautiful self-assured daughter, trying to picture her in a courtroom. She had height from both parents and her blonde hair from her father. She was a striking young woman. There had always been boys hanging around, but no one ever managed to win her heart. Maybe her parents' troubles made her gun-shy. "Connie, I know, and that's what makes it so hard, seeing him, being around him on days like today, days that were always anticipated and were to be filled with love and joy. I see what I've done to him, seeing him without the love that used to be in his eyes when he looked at me. God, how could I be so stupid? You need to stop beating yourself up, and Dr. Willits said you have to give it time. You and Dad have to have time to heal." Beatrix had no response. She thought about how the doctor had helped her, but sometimes she sincerely wished her attempt at suicide had succeeded. She knew she could never tell that to Connie or Dr. Willits. She and Sterling did need time to heal, but to what end? Beatrix watched the sky through the open sunroof of her daughter's BMW. "I loved seeing the 2 of you together today." There was a long period of silence before Connie said, "Is he still going ahead with the divorce?" "Yes." She said it so softly Connie hardly heard her. They drove in silence for a long time after that, each lost in her own thoughts. During their last meeting only a few weeks earlier, Sterling had sat next to her on the big couch at her apartment at the Redwood as she cried. They were supposed to be discussing the property settlement. She knew this was the final act of their marriage. The end of their union, and the loneliness without Sterling filled her with dread. She desperately needed to feel his arms around her one more time, but he just couldn't do it. Very quietly he said, "Beatrix, you must understand. The hurt and sorrow of these last few years are so ingrained now, that despite how I love you and miss you, Or at least the Beatrix I married. I can't blot that from my mind. You betrayed me, and our family, and I won't allow myself to ever be hurt by you again. I know you remember your promise from 23 years ago, when you said you'd never hurt me again. You said I was your only love and always had been, and you were sorry and had been so incredibly stupid to let me get away, and that you had missed me so terribly. You promised. He fled the apartment, but not before she saw the tears. The chiming of the doorbell brought Beatrix's thoughts back to the present. It was time to go and start a new phase in her life, a phase without the man she'd been married to for over 20 years. Mrs. Beatrix Marshall? Beatrix was surprised to see a tall, handsome, sandy-haired man dressed in a gray suit at her door. Yes. He held out an identification wallet and said, "I'm Special Agent Dean George, FBI. May I come in?" Beatrix just looked at him for a few moments. "Yes, come in." She led him into the living room. She had already talked to police and prosecuting attorneys at length in preparation for her testimony against Cole Harvey, but she knew that case was resolved with some kind of plea agreement. She had done her best to put all thoughts of Cole and their affair out of her mind. It really wasn't an affair, it was just fucking trading sex for drugs. It was worse than an affair. A visit from the FBI brought all those memories back. Her stomach knotted. She flushed as she watched his eyes travel over her body. She had not thought about sex in a pleasurable way for months, but she was appreciative that this handsome man would look at her that way. She quickly quashed those thoughts, feeling guilty all over again. What was wrong with her? Of course, she was now no longer married, so what difference did it make? "What can I do for you, Agent George?" "I'd like to ask you some questions about Cole Harvey." Beatrix's stomach knotted tighter just hearing the name. She quickly sat in the chair by the window, knees weak, suddenly feeling like she'd been struck. After a few moments she looked up and said, "Oh, sorry, please have a seat." She gestured toward the large leather-covered couch that faced the bay. "Mrs. Marshall, are you all right?" Beatrix nodded. "Please just call me Beatrix. I am no longer Mrs. Marshall." "I'm sorry to hear that. I'll try to be brief." Beatrix waited, feeling a chill in her body. "Do you recall the last time you saw Mr. Harvey?" Beatrix went white and was afraid she was going to lose her breakfast. She clenched her hands as she relived the nightmare that was that Saturday night, when Cole had filled her with cocaine and alcohol, and brought in another partner in the firm and a prostitute. They had fucked her through the night. The next morning she fled for home and tried to kill herself. In a shaky voice she said, Saturday night, about 7 months ago. That was the last time. It should all be in the police reports." Tears came to her eyes. "You've not seen him since?" She shook her head as she studied her hands. "Mrs. Marshall, sorry. Beatrix, I don't know if you've heard, but Mr. Harvey disappeared a week ago today, vanished." She looked at him and said in a quiet voice, "I'm not really surprised. Cole is an opportunist and a coward. I am surprised he stuck around this long, considering the trouble he was in. Well, there is more to it than that. He didn't take much with him, only his car keys, wallet, and passport. Everything else is still at his condo. We haven't been able to locate his car yet either. We think he was gone about 8 hours before his disappearance was discovered. We were also fairly certain he would turn up quickly. But he's vanished. I thought he had made some kind of deal for his testimony. Maybe those drug people got to him." George just looked at her. "Maybe. Am I a suspect? You must know our history. And up to a few weeks ago I was going to testify against him, until the prosecutors made some deal with him for a plea. Do you think I would go after him myself because I thought that wasn't going to be punishment enough?" Her voice had risen in anger as she spoke. Agent George raised his hands, palms toward her. "Mrs. Eyre. Beatrix, you are not a suspect. We know you never left the Redwood that night. We talked to security and even reviewed the security camera discs. Then why? Why am I here?" She nodded. "It concerns your husband." Her stomach lurched again. Was Sterling involved in the disappearance of Cole? Had she driven him to murder Cole? "Do you have any idea where your ex-husband was a week ago today?" No. We don't see each other much, and he travels, mainly to Asia." What Beatrix didn't tell Special Agent George was that exactly a week ago was the date their divorce was final. Beatrix's attorney called her in the afternoon to tell her. She went to her bedroom, pulled the covers over her head, and sobbed for hours, truly regretting Sterling had found her before she died. Special Agent George. I have to tell you that no matter what I did or Cole did, I can't imagine Sterling had anything to do with Cole's disappearance. He's a kind and gentle man, and always has been. Our actions deeply wounded him, but someone who would harm Cole, no. Beatrix, I think your ex-husband had the motive and opportunity to make Mr. Harvey disappear. Harvey destroyed your marriage. Let's get one thing straight, Agent George. Cole Harvey did not destroy my marriage. I did. I'm fully at fault. Cole was merely a catalyst for disaster. George thought for a few moments. Your ex-husband might not see it that way. She didn't answer. Beatrix, do you know what your husband did during his 4 years in the Marines? No, we weren't together then. Only after. Beatrix's voice trailed off as she fought off nausea with the memories of how they lost track of each other, and how he reappeared in her life. Actually, it was she who had lost Sterling. Let him go, no worse. She had rejected him, only to find out she had been dreadfully wrong and stupid. Beatrix, in the Marines, your former husband, was a sniper. His records show he killed 46 men. Beatrix felt dizzy. She had never known or suspected. Sterling was much changed after his service, but they never talked about it. She put it down to growing up in a tough branch of the military. I spoke to his former commander, and he told me the actual count was probably twice that high. He was known as Ace Marshal. He never missed. He was in the worst spots, the Middle East, Central America, Africa, and Afghanistan under the Soviets, a tough job. Very tough. But that was over 20 years ago. I know, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but he has killed, and he was very good at it. Beatrix was shocked. Beatrix, does your husband own a gun? She shook her head. I've never seen Sterling with a gun. Never would have allowed one in my house. Even the few pictures from his days in the Marines, I never saw one where he had any weapon. He jotted a note in a small notebook he took from his pocket. You may wonder why the FBI is investigating this case now. Well, the disappearance of a witness in a case having the potential to bring down some major international drug traffickers is of interest to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney for California. The amounts turned over by an anonymous informant, and the search of Mr. Harvey's office and home, showed he was a major player in the Bay Area. He won immunity for his testimony against several drug traffickers in and around the city, and maybe some bigger fish. Fortunately, he had testified before a grand jury and several indictments were handed down just a couple of weeks ago. Regardless, ATF dropped the ball on his surveillance and he disappeared. Conventional thinking is that his drug-dealing buddies got to him. I'm not so sure. He stared at the water down below. Finally, seeming to make a decision, he said, I should also tell you that another partner in your firm was badly beaten the same night. What? Who? Marcus Lamont. The shocks kept coming. Memories of that last night at the Hyatt, as Mark had taken her with Cole cheering him on, made her head swim. Mark was a married black man with 2 beautiful children and a lovely wife. Beatrix never suspected he would do that to her. He told her that he had lusted after her for years, and he was going to give her a night to remember. He kept asking her how she liked his big black cock. Even with the drugs and alcohol, she knew he was no bigger than Sterling. She was ashamed that she told him how wonderful he felt, despite the fact he was being selfish and never gave a thought to her pleasure. Is he dead? No, but he may never walk normally again. They smashed him up pretty well with a pipe. Mr. Lamont had numerous fractures, including both kneecaps. His assailant knew what he was doing, just enough to hurt him badly but not enough to kill him. When Lamont regained consciousness, he said he never saw his attacker and thought it was just a sadistic mugger. He was not very cooperative. Beatrix was stunned. Beatrix, my job is putting puzzles together. I follow the money or the motives. I think somehow Marcus was involved with what happened to you. In some way. He worked in the firm with you, and he was a friend of Mr. Harvey for several years before he was married. The hospital talk screen also showed cocaine in his body the night he was attacked. You are the logical link, and we know that your husband knew about you and Cole Harvey. Beatrix looked at him. She was overwhelmed by this news, although she had to admit she was strangely pleased Cole Harvey was most likely dead and Marcus Lamont might never walk again. But Sterling as the avenging angel? She had a hard time grasping that concept. Plus, how would Sterling know Mark was involved in that hotel room that Saturday night? She had never told anyone that detail. She was too ashamed. Do you want to tell me about him? Agent George. Everything came out in the police investigation. That's all I have to say. Everything had come out in the police investigation. An anonymous source had tipped off the police that Cole was a drug dealer, and that somehow Beatrix had been involved with him. The police had visited her in her hospital room and Sterling was there. After the police left, she confessed to Sterling and begged his forgiveness. She knew that her attempt at suicide, and his finding her had devastated him, but the anger and sorrow he displayed after hearing her story had scalded her like escaping steam. After that, he never touched her or held her, despite how she needed him. How would Sterling have known about Mark? Maybe it was just a random mugging. No, it was too much of a coincidence. What else did Sterling know? She was having a hard time keeping the nausea in check. Agent George sat quietly watching her. I'm sorry. I really don't think I can help you. She shivered as she said it. Oh, don't worry. I'll keep plugging away. It's what I do. He stood. By the way, have you ever heard the name? Or has your husband ever mentioned the name? Jagger? No, I don't think so. Why? He ignored her question. How about Eric Douglas? That was a name she knew. A name she hadn't heard since high school. The only Eric Douglas I know, or can recall, was my husband's best friend in high school, but that was a long time ago. That Mr. Douglas is wanted in several countries. He's wanted for numerous computer crimes, including robbing banks by exploiting holes in their security systems and stealing millions from various individuals, companies, and governments worldwide. He fancies himself as some kind of Robin Hood, and goes by the name Jagger. We believe many of his victims never report the thefts because what is stolen is illegal money or goods. Regardless, we believe he and your husband have kept in contact and they aid each other. Agent George, I'm positive you're mistaken. I've never seen nor heard of Eric Douglas since high school, and I'm sure Sterling hasn't either. They were friends in high school, but how would you make that connection this many years later? Mrs. Marshall, you may not remember, but your husband didn't attend his high school graduation. Another painful memory washed over Beatrix. She certainly did remember. She saw herself sitting in the auditorium, an often postponed gift for him in her lap and an empty chair next to her where Sterling was supposed to be seated. He was arrested the week before graduation along with his friend Eric Douglas. What? Apparently they were brilliant computer guys even then. It was a prank that got them into several fledgling scientific and government computer systems through the newly installed system at UC Berkeley. Security was almost non-existent at the time and they had built their own hacker devices. Eric made bail and later the charges were dropped. Frankly, other than a misdemeanor trespassing charge, there were no laws on the books at that time to go after them for what they did. Beatrix couldn't speak, much less respond. Your ex-husband made a mistake by refusing bail. He did speak to his parents, but apparently even then he refused bail. He asked the magistrate to let him join the Marines. The prosecutor dropped the charges and the recruiter took him. It seemed like he didn't care about anything. He just wanted to get away. Eric Douglas went on to Cal Poly and majored in math and engineering. He got a job with a small company in Silicon Valley that helped design security software. He worked there for about 6 years. One day he handed in his resignation and disappeared. Beatrix, can you guess the name of the Silicon Valley company? She knew the answer. Zenith, she said quietly. Yes. He and your husband worked at Zenith together for at least 2 years, after Sterling graduated from Cal Poly. Wonder how he found that job, he asked pointedly. Now, we're pretty sure Eric, aka Jagger, is living in the Bay Area somewhere. Why are you telling me this? Your husband is not the man you think he is, and I think he is very much involved in the disappearance of Cole Harvey and the attack on Marcus Lamont. I don't know what to say, Agent George. I never knew Eric and Sterling worked together or anything about what he did in the Marines, but I can assure you that Sterling did not have anything to do with the disappearance of Cole Moline or harm to Mark Lamont. Her words even sounded uncertain to her. Beatrix, the night Mr. Harvey went missing there were several malfunctions with the security cameras in his building. Lobby cameras, elevator cameras, and then the camera in the hallway outside his door malfunctioned for about 5 minutes at. George looked at his notes. 10:02 p.m. A short time later, cameras in the west side stairwell went blank as well as the camera just outside the building at the base of those stairs. There was no sign of forcible entry anywhere in the building or at Mr. Harvey's condo. I don't know much about these security cameras, but our IT guys tell me that they've heard rumors that some of our brother federal agencies have certain devices that could cause this. Beatrix could see where George was going with this. Special Agent George, my husband is a respected businessman and a non-violent person. Just because he knows about computers and computer security software, and was long ago associated with Eric Douglas, doesn't make him any more involved than I am, and anyway it could just be a computer glitch. George just looked at her. He was not convinced. Beatrix walked him to the door, his card in her hand. Thank you, Beatrix, for taking the time to talk to me. I hope you enjoy your new home in El Cerrito. Best of luck. She closed the door and stood there for a long time. She had not mentioned her move to El Cerrito. Special Agent George was thorough. More importantly, was Sterling a murderer? Was he a computer criminal? After 23 years of marriage, she began to see him in a different light. If he did these things, did that mean he still cared for her, or was it simply revenge on the men who had abused and taken advantage of her? Did he mean to harm her too? How could he hurt her any more than he already had? She shook her head as if she could make all these thoughts go away. She looked at herself in the mirror once more. She saw a very unhappy woman with tear-streaked makeup. No, Sterling loved her too much to physically harm her. His revenge was just this, his absence and her knowing she would never feel his arms around her again. Finally, in despair, she on the couch and looked at the blue water of the bay without seeing it. Oh, Sterling, what have I done? What have I done? I've been such a fool. I love you. She sat and let the tears come again, recounting memories. What a wonderful surprise. Thank you, Connie. Beatrix hugged her daughter as she looked around her living room. Somehow Connie had managed to unpack many of her belongings and put the house into livable condition. There were fresh flowers in vases in the living room and on the dining room table. The large sofa was in the exact spot Beatrix had envisioned. It was facing San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge. The view was spectacular, and on this perfect summer day, it stretched from the Richmond Bridge in the north to downtown San Francisco in the south. Beatrix loved the serenity of this place, and she knew the solitude would help her heal. She still had weekly appointments with Dr. Hannah for the foreseeable future, but she was convinced the worst was over. She frowned, thinking that no, the worst of her illness and battle with alcohol and drugs was over, but her life without Sterling was just beginning, and that was the worst. She had never imagined such a thing. Never imagined things could get so bad that Sterling would turn his back on her. She knew she should have known better, since it had happened once before and she had almost lost him. Then, as now, she had taken him for granted, taken his love for granted more likely, and her reckless stupidity drove him away. She was very grateful Connie would be living with her while she attended law school. Connie, her eldest, was always the level-headed one, the analytical one. She was also the pragmatic one, who seemed to accept people and their foibles. Beatrix tried to make up with Brady, but he was stubborn like his father, and he was having a hard time getting past the injuries he had suffered at her hands, even though he knew that his mother had been suffering from alcohol and cocaine addiction and depression. With the intercession of Dr. Willits, Brady was slowly coming to accept her treatment of him was a manifestation of her illness, and not absence of love. Beatrix did know he rightfully blamed her for the breakup of the marriage because of the horrible treatment of his father. Beatrix could only respond with regret and apologies. He was still wary, but she felt confident he would eventually welcome the return of his loving and caring mother. Ready for lunch? Beatrix turned to see Connie setting plates of sandwiches on the dining table. It was a step up from the living room and adjacent to the kitchen. Both had the same view of San Francisco Bay. They ate and drank their tea in silence for several minutes, each lost in thought. So what now? What now? What? Beatrix smiled at her daughter, knowing she was quizzing her about her plans. She was not going back to Madison and Trasker. That was foregone conclusion when Cole Harvey had been arrested and the police, ATF and the IRS had descended on the firm. It barely survived after paying fines and settling suits brought by Beatrix and other members of the firm who had fallen victim to Cole and others. Much smaller now, the firm had given up its very expensive office space in downtown San Francisco and moved across the bay to Oakland. Beatrix knew she had to go back to work for her own sanity. I'm starting back to work next week. You know, a girl has to pay the rent. Now it was Connie's turn to smile. I knew you wouldn't be able to just sit here and watch the view, but I thought you might take a little time. Connie, I've been cooped up in the redwood for too long. I need to be able to get out and do something. Beatrix frowned with the realization that this was the time she had thought about for years, the time when the kids were out of the house, and she and Sterling, financially more than comfortable, could travel to those places she had dreamed about. Now she was going to work to help pass the time and to help her concentrate on something more than her loss of Sterling. Connie poured tea as they put away the lunch dishes and then settled on the big sofa. So what's the job? It's a paralegal job with a woman who's in solo practice. She used to work for one of the big firms in town, had an affair with one of the young partners. Her marriage exploded. Beatrix wiped a tear with the back of her hand and tried to smile. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Connie took her hand, distressed by the sudden sorrow in her mother's eyes. Mother, I just wish there was something I could do. Beatrix grabbed a tissue from the container on the coffee table in front of them and dabbed her eyes and again tried to smile. Anyway, her name's Celia Kennedy, and her office is in the 100 Stewart building. It's right behind One Market where I used to work. In fact, on the corner out front is Mike and Tom's coffee cart. It's where I always go for my morning chai. Beatrix smiled sadly. Nice, I don't have to go looking for a decent chai. Anyway, Celia just moved into the building. She was up on Geary Street, but she needed more room because her practice is starting to take off, and she decided she could use a paralegal. I'm not sure how she heard about me, but she called me one day at the Redwood and then came to visit. We've had lunch a couple of times and I really like her. Her ex, also named Sterling, was one of the mergers and acquisition gurus in town, but after their marriage went south, he quit that, went to work for some international shipping conglomerate for a few years and now runs the largest PI firm in the Bay Area. She paused, blinking away tears. With his new wife. Mother, you can't really think Dad's even thinking of that, and anyway he still loves you. I know he's not seeing anyone. He travels and when he comes back he just stays in his condo. Don't you think there might be a chance? Beatrix hung her head. More tears came. I hurt him so much. I don't know if he'll ever forgive me. Connie saw her mother's pain. He's hurting, but I can't believe he won't decide some morning that you two belong together. Connie, I never told you I broke up with your father in high school. I was stupid and drove him away. He eventually forgave me. Years later, but I promised him I would never hurt him again. But I did, didn't I? She said as the tears flowed. What? Mother, Brady and I both know the story. Grandma and Grandpa Williams must have told it 100 times over the years. You and Dad living across the street from each other, friends since you were toddlers, walking to school together, getting married after Dad got out of the Marines. What happened? Connie was surprised to see her mother put her head down and slowly shake her head. Beatrix's eyes glistened as she finally looked at her daughter. That's the sanitized version. We started together and ended up married, but I almost lost your father because I took his love for granted. I was immature and stupid. Surprised, Connie just watched her grieving mother. Beatrix paused and took a deep breath. It started at the end of our sophomore year in high school. In the spring, I was selected for the pep squad. I had wanted to be a cheerleader for years, and suddenly my dream came true. Your father and I weren't dating, we just were. We went places together and hung out together. We were a couple. We walked to school every day. Connie smiled, picturing her parents as teens. We were only a couple of weeks from the end of school when I found out about the pep squad. I was ecstatic and I told your father, and I kept going on and on about how excited I was as we walked home from school. I admit I was a little disappointed by his reaction. He was my best friend and I wanted him to be excited too, but I detected I didn't know what it was. Like an idiot, I thought he was jealous. I don't know why I thought that. Your father always seemed like the guy who was the most comfortable in his own skin. Beatrix looked off at the water in the distance, gathering her thoughts. Even then he was tall, but he was skinny, and I guess you'd call him a math and science geek. He was brilliant in school. I had to work hard for my math and science grades, and I was happy to have him to help, but he was never a show-off. Connie refreshed their tea as she listened to her mother. Things were kind of strained between us for the next couple of weeks. Maybe not with your father. He either didn't notice or pretended not to. Things got better as we started into the summer, and then it was time for our annual trip to Tahoe. Well, you know that your grandparents had been friends for a long time, and every year we went to the lake for almost 2 weeks. It was a wonderful time. They always rented a couple of cabins and a ski boat, and we spent our time outside, water skiing, or walking in the woods, or looking at the stars. Beatrix sat back, reliving the memories of that summer on the lake. Toward the end of the first week, your dad and I were lying on the pontoon on the lake and watching the stars come out, and all of a sudden we were kissing. We had never kissed before. Actually, I had never kissed a boy before, and I was sure your father hadn't kissed a girl. I discovered he was a wonderful kisser. Beatrix paused and sipped her tea, her eyes glowing. We lay there for a long time holding hands, staring at the stars. I trembled as I pressed against him. We were just in our swimsuits. I also remember the warm breeze across the lake. Then he said something that I thought was very strange. "You won't forget me, will you?" I rolled on top of him, feeling his warmth, and looked at him in the darkness, and told him he had been my best friend all my life. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "I don't ever want us to be apart, and with your schedule next year." I just looked at him and pressed myself against him, and I told him I'd never forget him and I didn't ever want us to be apart. The rest of the time at the lake was magical. I know our parents noticed the change in us. There wasn't the normal horseplay and teasing. We had become a couple. Oh, we never went further than kissing and some mild body exploration, but there seemed to be all the time in the world for more. Beatrix stared at the view of the city across the bay, collecting her thoughts. It was too bad I didn't listen to him. She paused again. A couple of weeks later that all changed when cheer camp began. Suddenly I was caught up in the new life of a cheerleader, and I hardly had time for your father. Before I had a chance to think, school was starting. For the first time in my life I was absent from the Marshall's Labor Day cookout. I had been invited to a pool party hosted by the head cheerleader Emily Spencer. Her parents were out of town, and there was lots of beer and a crowd of older boys. I loved the attention and the feeling that I was part of this new group, the beautiful people, the in-crowd of Berkeley High. I vaguely remembered my mother telling me that your dad stopped by a couple of times, but I couldn't even be bothered to call him. Then it was the first day of school. Beatrix got up and stood by the French doors to the deck, staring at the water. How could I have been so stupid? Stupid. Finally she returned to the sofa. He caught up with me in the busy hallway between classes. I was with some other cheerleaders, and we were wearing our uniforms for the pep rally later that day, and he said something about stopping by my house that morning and my mother telling him I'd left already. I felt embarrassed that some math geek was talking to me in front of my new friends, and I told him I had taken a ride with Sally. Beatrix paused to wipe tears. He knew from my tone that we would not be walking to school together ever again. I turned and walked off with the other girls. The worst was when one of them said, "Geek," loud enough for most of the people in the hall to hear. I'm ashamed to say I laughed with the rest as we walked away. I hardly saw him the rest of our junior year. We didn't have any classes together, and he wasn't a jock, so he wasn't at the games or other meets. Beatrix paused again, thinking about those days over 20 years ago. That Christmas, for the first time, your dad didn't show up at my parents' Christmas party and open house. I was dating a football player at the time and hardly gave it a thought until I was helping my mother clean up after the party. I asked her if she liked Bennett, and she gave me the mother look like, "You can't be serious." Bennett was a football player and had, well, it should have been your dad. To him I was just another notch on his belt, and he was an insensitive jerk and not near the kisser your father was. Nor was he a good lover, but I didn't know any better. Like I said, I was stupid. She shook her head. Then your grandmother said that she hadn't seen your father that day or much of him since the summer. Mom just let the thought hang there. I tried to tell her I was sure he was busy. Actually, I had no idea why he hadn't come. His parents had been there, but I hadn't talked to them. A vague feeling of unease came over me. I couldn't really remember the last time your dad and I had spoken. Unfortunately, a few days later I had forgotten all about the conversation with Grandma and the party. Connie moved to her mother and put her arms around her as Beatrix continued. Soon it was summer again, and one day, I was with another cheerleader named Sophie. We had gone to the Berkeley public pool to pick up her little brother. When we walked in, I was astonished to see your father. He was a lifeguard and swim instructor, and he could only be described as a hunk. He had reached his full height and his body was bronzed from the sun. He only wore a white tank top and a dark blue Speedo. I came up to him and asked how he was doing, and Sophie gave me a look, like, "You know this guy and you haven't introduced me to him?" I did introduce her, and her interest was so obvious it was disgusting. I could practically smell the heat coming off her. As we stood there talking, a beautiful blonde girl came up and put her arm through his, obviously staking her claim. She was gorgeous, with a model's height and figure, wearing a man's white shirt over a very small yellow two-piece. Beatrix looked at her daughter, comforted by her concern as the emotions of the memory threatened to overwhelm her. I realized I knew who she was. She was the younger sister of our lead cheerleader, Emily. Her name was Beverly, and she was going to be a junior. In the fall, I saw how your dad looked at her, and then it hit me, he used to look at me that way. I went home and cried for days. I had been stupid, and now he was gone. All the fun and excitement of being a cheerleader seemed to leave me like air from a balloon. I stayed with it, of course. There was no going back. And when school started in the fall, I saw them together everywhere, at social events, games, holding hands in the hall. My social life dried up. I realized how much I loved your father, but I had taken him for granted. Beatrix stopped her narrative and then said, "Kind of like I did this time." Connie hugged her mother, amazed at the story. She realized how painful it was for her mother and understood why she'd never heard it before. "But he must have loved you. You ended up with him. You must have done something right." Connie watched more tears as she waited for her mother's response. "I remember your dad's parents coming to the Christmas party that year. I learned that he was spending the holidays with Beverly and her family skiing at Whistler Resort in British Columbia. I bought your dad a leather-covered journal and planned to give it to him at the party. I don't know why I thought he would come. I had a miserable Christmas. Your grandmother was very understanding and pulled me through it. She told me some things were meant to be and others weren't. She's a smart woman and basically told me to get on with my life." Connie was speechless. It was hard for her to fathom what it must have been like for both of them in high school. When school started again in January, everything was different. There was no sign of Beverly, and your father was only seen sporadically. There were terrible rumors around the school, rumors your father had beaten and abused Beverly while they were in Canada, and that your father was going to have to go back to Canada to stand trial. A friend of mine who worked in the vice principal's office confirmed that the vice principal had had a couple of conversations with the BC Police and the Canadian Mounted Police. We found out that Beverly transferred to Piedmont High and your dad was taking mostly independent studies that kept him away from school. Connie stared at her mother. She hardly knew how to respond. She couldn't imagine her father doing anything like that, much less being accused of such a thing. "Mom, what did you think?" Red-eyed, she looked up at her daughter. "I was so confused. I didn't know what to think. I thought I knew your father and his kindness and gentleness, but the rumors wouldn't go away. One day I even asked Emily, but she told me that she couldn't talk about it, since there was an ongoing investigation. As we got closer to graduation, your father was never seen, but the rule was that if you were to graduate you had to show up for graduation. I knew he had to be there. I even brought the journal I had bought him for Christmas, but he didn't show up that night. Didn't show for graduation too." Beatrix wiped tears, and then went on. "There was a huge party at Emily's house after graduation. I wasn't seeing anyone at the time, so I thought I'd just put in an appearance. I had a couple of beers and went upstairs to use the bathroom because there was a line at the bathrooms downstairs. When I left the bathroom, I passed Beverly's room. The door was slightly ajar and she was there with her sister. I saw them sitting on the bed and I heard them talking and stopped to listen. I don't know why. Emily was trying to get her to join the party and I heard Beverly tell her that she couldn't and she wasn't in the mood to be around a bunch of her drunken friends. Then Emily asked her, when are you going to snap out of it, and told her she couldn't keep herself locked up forever, over some bastard who wasn't even good enough for her. I really didn't know what I was hearing, but I had a feeling it was about your father, but then I was surprised when Beverly defended him. Beverly told her sister not to call him names, and then said something like, it was her fault, all her fault. She cried as she said it. Emily yelled at her to stop crying and said he should have been more understanding and that she hated him and he was a jerk. I was thoroughly confused as I listened, and I thought I should leave, but then Beverly sobbed and said something like he's kind and wonderful and he loved her, and she betrayed him, and he was so angry she just wanted to die. Emily said she didn't care what she did to your dad, but she just knew he hurt her little sister and she made him pay. And Beverly looked very upset and asked Emily what she did, and she said she fixed him by starting rumors all over the school that he was an animal, and he raped her while they were in Canada over Christmas. Beverly just fell on the bed sobbing and saying no, 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 and then Emily said she even got the vice principal to call the BC police. Beverly just looked at her sister, tears rolling down her face, and she went white when her sister said she got their father to help too. Emily said she found out from Sherry in the guidance office where your father, who she called that bastard, applied for college, and Daddy made some phone calls. She told Beverly that her ex-boyfriend had discovered that Stanford, Caltech, and Berkeley were no longer interested in having him as a student. Emily sat next to her sister with a face glowing in triumph while Beverly just lay on the bed, her arms wrapped around herself and cried. Connie, that's how I learned that the rumors about your dad were all lies. I never did find out what caused his breakup with Beverly, but she must have hurt him pretty badly. Something happened up there in Canada that killed his love for her and he wanted nothing more to do with her. She still loved him, which was obvious from what I saw. I was so upset that I left the party and I never spoke to Emily again. My God, Mother, how horrible for Dad. He must have heard the rumors, but he still loved her enough that he didn't try to defend himself. Or maybe he was so crushed by her that he just didn't care. Beatrix replied. Did you go to Dad and tell him what you heard? No. I didn't see your dad until he came back from the Marines over 4 years later. I would have thought you'd want to tell him. I did, but when I went to his house the next day, everyone was gone. His parents had moved across the country to South Carolina. I asked my mother about it, and she said she had told me some weeks before that they were leaving and how sad she was that her best friends were going to be across the country. Obviously, I was so wrapped up in myself that I hadn't heard her or ignored her. Not uncommon for a teenage girl. She looked at Connie, trying to smile. I didn't know your dad was even in the Marines until sometime later. I think it was a letter Mom got from the Marshals. At that point, I think I just gave up on ever being with your father again. For a long time, I thought about him every day, but finally I started dating again while I was at Cal. So what happened? What happened? It was Connie's turn to attempt to smile. Yes. How did you and Dad get back together? I mean, obviously you did. She watched her mother's gaze turn back to the water. Connie, enough of this for now. I'm wrung out. I think I'll go lie down for a bit. The twist of fate. Mom, you're not really going to wear that on your date tonight, are you? Beverly sat at her vanity, dressed only in a blue silk robe, and smiled in the mirror at her 16-year-old daughter, Charlotte. First of all, it's not a date. It's just dinner with a friend. And secondly, what's wrong with what I'm going to wear? Charlotte gestured at the blouse and skirt on the bed. That's what you wear to work every day. The only thing missing is your lab coat. Charlotte walked into her mother's closet and began looking through the hanging clothes. Beverly could hear hangers sliding on the closet rails. Charlotte called out from the closet. So, this friend from work, is he another researcher? Beverly knew Charlotte was dying of curiosity since Beverly rarely went out. In the 2 years since Davis had died, Beverly had devoted herself to their daughter and to work. Davis had been a wonderful husband and father, and they both missed him terribly. No, he owns the computer company that's upgrading all our systems. From the closet, Charlotte said, So he's some computer geek? Beverly smiled, as an image of Sterling Marshall came to mind. Sterling was far from a geek. He was tall and handsome and soft-spoken, but when he spoke, people listened. He had a presence that people had a hard time ignoring. Suddenly she flushed as she remembered how Sterling's strong body had felt against hers all those years ago when they were in high school and she was madly in love with him. He was a wonderful, caring lover who had made her crazy. Beverly was glad her daughter couldn't see her reaction. Charlotte was a perceptive girl. And truth be told, since Davis died, Beverly had felt a rekindling of the love she and Sterling had shared in high school. It wasn't that she didn't miss her late husband. He was a brilliant, caring man who had loved her with all his heart. It was just that working so close with Sterling sometimes for days on end, and long days they were, she fell in love with him all over again. Sterling had been her first love, and when they broke up she was devastated. For months it seemed she had an elephant sitting on her chest. She just couldn't breathe. Even in a new school away from him she was miserable. It had been her fault, and that made it worse, and then when she discovered her sister's savage plot to ruin Sterling in high school, she was devastated all over again. Sterling disappeared after he finished school, and nobody seemed to know where he had gone. And then one day more than 4 years later, he walked into her lab at Berkeley. Mom, are you with me? Did you hear what I said? While she was lost in thought, Charlotte had come out of her closet holding a chic little black dress and matching pumps that Beverly hadn't worn in a long time, which had impossibly high heels. The dress was a classic black dress, sleeveless, with spaghetti straps and a bit shorter than she was comfortable with these days. Not that she still didn't have the legs to pull it off. She had never worn it. Beverly had bought it to wear for their wedding anniversary dinner, but that was the week when their lives were turned upside down because Davis was diagnosed with cancer of the spinal cord. Had it really been 4 years ago? Beverly smiled and shook her head. I don't think so. It's much too. Too what? Charlotte replied. Sexy. Holding it in front of herself, she wondered if she could borrow it for the junior prom. And don't even think about borrowing it. Beverly laughed. Charlotte's face reddened, knowing her mother had read her so easily. Changing tactics, Charlotte said, So what do you know about this guy? Well, he owns his own company, he's brilliant, has a son at Stanford, a daughter in law school at Berkeley, and well, he's nice looking. Oh, how nice looking, Charlotte teased. Very. Now can we change the subject? Only if you'll tell me how you met? She turned around on the chair and faced her daughter, struggling to think about what to say. She and Sterling had now been working together for almost 3 years, and the computer upgrade project was about to be completed. That bothered her more than she'd like to admit. Seeing Sterling made her day, and she would miss the quick brown bag lunches they often shared, sometimes in a conference room filled with medical center tech staff and Sterling's people. It didn't matter, just being around him brightened her life. During that final year of Davis's life, as his illness took a greater toll, she found herself relying on Sterling more and more as a friend. He was someone she could trust and never worry about what might find its way into the medical center gossip chain. On the day of Davis's funeral, Sterling had come to the memorial service and to the cemetery. She was aware of him amidst the throngs of mourners as he stood a few paces behind her, but they never got a chance to speak. She was greatly comforted by his presence. And as she turned away from the grave on that blustery and cool San Francisco day and watched him stride away toward his car, she finally gave in and admitted she had developed strong feelings for him. Was she deluding herself? Were her feelings just a reflection of the intense passion they shared all those years ago? Or was this something new? Or was she just confused and vulnerable and seeking solace in a man who was a friend? Did he feel anything more than friendship and sympathy? During the year they worked together before Davis's death, he had never shown anything but the affection and loyalty of a friend. Of course, Sterling was married, but Beverly knew little of his marriage. Sterling was certainly proud of his son and daughter, but he rarely said anything about his wife. Hello, Mother. You still with me? Oh, sorry. I've known Sterling since high school. Charlotte looked at her, sensing something more. He was my first boyfriend. There, she had said it, but those words unleashed such a sorrow. It was hard to control the tears that sprang to her eyes. She grabbed a tissue and dabbed at her eyes, watching her daughter's expression change from someone who was going to make a wise-assed remark to a caring daughter. Charlotte put the dress on the bed and came over and put her arms around her mother. He must have hurt you badly. Beverly was at a loss for words as the sobs came out. She just couldn't imagine where the stabbing hurt had come from. After more than 20 years, the memory of Sterling walking away from her in the park across from the high school that rainy early January day was as fresh and painful as the day it happened. After a few minutes, Beverly composed herself. Charlotte moved away to the bed and sat facing her. She felt very protective of her mother, and she couldn't imagine why she would even consider seeing a man who had hurt her so badly, even if it was years ago. Beverly blew her nose and looked at Charlotte, feeling some explanation was needed, and said, He was the love of my life, my first love. He was a senior, and I was a junior. We met at the Berkeley pool during the summer. He was a lifeguard. She smiled a bit at the memory of their first meeting the shy lifeguard with the intense gray eyes and the killer body. So he took advantage of you and then broke your heart, right? Charlotte asked. Her tone told Beverly exactly what she thought of him. Beverly held back more tears with a great deal of will. No, he loved me with all his heart, but I did something incredibly stupid and I hurt him so much that he couldn't stand the sight of me. Beverly hung her head and the tears came again. Charlotte was confused because her mother was the epitome of the professional woman, a woman who blasted through college in 3 years at the top of her class, was accepted to medical school at 21, married her mentor Davis Powell, a brilliant research scientist, and spent her years solving the riddles of awful diseases. How did this superwoman make a mistake that caused her such sorrow many years later? I'm sorry, Charlotte. I don't know what came over me. The memory of the day we broke up just washed over me. She smiled slightly and said, I thought I'd forgotten all about that. I'm being silly. She got up and joined her daughter, who was still sitting on the bed. She took her hands and said, sometimes memories which have been locked away decide to pop out at unexpected moments. Charlotte hugged her. Beverly knew she had lied to her daughter. Being around Sterling, especially after Davis died, had reminded her daily of her stupidity, and despite how she tried to rationalize it as the misjudgment of a hormonal teen, it was still there in all its darkness. Finally Beverly said, guess I'd better get back to getting ready. Charlotte stood and picked up the black dress. This is definite. You're going to show this guy that he shouldn't have ditched you all those years ago. She grinned at her mother, nodding her head. Beverly looked at her and then at the dress. You're right. Tonight, it will be eat your heart out, Sterling Marshall. Charlotte smirked at her and put the dress back on the bed. The mood had lightened. He's coming here? Beverly nodded. Well then I'll be interested in meeting this guy, especially if he's good-looking. Now are we talking about hunky good-looking, or just not bad for an old guy? Beverly made a face at her daughter. Get out of here and let me finish getting ready. On second thought, Mom, maybe you should just go with the skirt and blouse. Charlotte laughed. Go. Yes, Mother, she said in her most insincere voice. Out. As she left smiling, she said, I'll listen for the door. As Beverly stepped into the shower, she reminded herself that this date had come about because Beverly had asked Sterling out. She had watched him cocoon himself after the divorce and decided it was time for him to get on with his life, and she was determined to be the woman who helped him do that. She knew that she wanted to see him away from work, so she could explore the feelings for him that had been growing since Davis's death. Actually, she knew her feelings. She just didn't know how Sterling viewed their relationship. She wanted more than friendship. Beverly did wish Sterling had felt close enough to her to unburden himself about what had happened to his marriage. She knew some of the details, and the cause of the divorce was a betrayal on the part of his wife. She recalled the day that she first heard about a problem with Sterling's wife. What was her name? Oh yes, Beatrix. About a year ago he had arrived at the medical center for a meeting and he looked like hell. She called him aside at the break. Sterling, are you okay? She smiled at him and said, I'm your friend, so I can tell you that you look terrible. Feeling all right? I'm sorry, Beverly. Just some family health problems kept me pretty much occupied over the weekend. Is everyone okay? She said with genuine concern. He looked at her. The sadness in his eyes made her want to cry. My wife, she's been hospitalized. Sterling, why are you here? You should grab your things and go. This meeting can run itself. She looked back into the conference room and all the IT people had their heads together with Sterling's texts. It really didn't matter whether Sterling was there or not. She's unconscious and I couldn't just sit there and go crazy. Anyway, my daughter is with her right now. I'll check back tonight. Beverly took hold of his arm and steered him toward her office. She sat next to him on the couch. Can you talk about it? He sighed heavily. Beatrix tried to commit suicide. Beverly was shocked and had to suppress an urge to try to get all the medical details and said, Oh dear, I'm so sorry. Is she going to be okay? She's out of danger. Beverly didn't press for more, but after a minute or so he said, I got home from Taipei on Sunday morning and I found her. Beverly put her arms around Sterling and held him for several minutes. Sterling never provided any more details other than to give her an update on Beatrix's condition when she asked. Not long after she was released from the hospital, he announced he had moved out of their home and was divorcing her. Tricia was puzzled because she couldn't imagine Sterling abandoning a wife of over 20 years under those circumstances. She wondered if she had misjudged his character. No, she decided, Beatrix must have done something pretty terrible to Sterling to precipitate a divorce after Beatrix's hospitalization. On her own, she pieced together the story. When she heard that the law firm Madison and Trasker was downsizing and moving to Oakland, she called a female friend who was one of the attorneys. Beverly knew Sterling's wife had worked there. Beverly, several months ago the shit hit the fan around here. I'm moving on. This place is toxic. One of our paralegals tried to commit suicide. She was full of cocaine provided by one of our senior guys. An anonymous tip came into the DEA and they tore this place apart. They found a huge amount of drugs in his desk of all places. They think someone might have tipped him off since his computer was completely wiped. Even DEA's best guys couldn't recover a thing. I did wonder if he had time to wipe his computer, which is why he didn't flush the drugs. Puzzling. Did you know Beatrix Marshall? Beverly, why the questions? She paused for a moment. I'm a friend of Beatrix's husband. Oh? You can't just ask him? No. She paused for a few moments and then said, Look, Beverly, I just heard that some of the senior guys were trading cocaine for sex with some of the assistants, and that included Beatrix Marshall. That's all I know. Except there were some lawsuits and several firings and a mass exodus of attorneys from the firm. Thanks. I owe you. Her friend laughed. You can't afford me. But send me some business. I'll be over at Lloyd & Johnson. So Beverly had discovered what tore Sterling's marriage apart, saddened her. What had prompted Beatrix to get involved trading sex for drugs? She knew they had 2 children and apparently no money worries. Was Sterling an ogre who made life so miserable for Beatrix that she turned to drugs and suicide? Beverly just couldn't imagine such a thing. Of course, Beverly knew Beatrix from high school. Not well, of course, since Beatrix and Beverly's older sister Emily were on the pep squad together. There was some contact. After high school, she didn't recall ever seeing Beatrix again until maybe 3 years ago, not long after Sterling was awarded the huge contract to revamp the computer systems at the medical center. It was at a charity gala for the medical center, and it was also to honor Davis. He had rallied enough to be able to attend in a wheelchair. The cancer was spreading fast, and it really was nothing but a matter of time. Just by chance, they were seated at a table for 8 with Sterling and Beatrix. Even though it had been years since they had seen each other, the 2 women recognized each other instantly. The crowd was too big and the festivities too loud for much in the way of conversation. Beverly watched the 2 of them and saw the distance that seemed to overshadow their relationship. Beatrix was very attractive and probably didn't weigh much more than she had in high school. Beverly also noticed Beatrix seemed to be hitting the wine pretty hard. That evening Davis was honored and made a wonderful little speech, full of self-deprecating humor, and as usual gave many thanks to his staff who he recognized by name. By the time he finished and gave a heartfelt thanks to Beverly, there were many handkerchiefs in evidence. His pleas for more research funds made for a record fundraising evening. As things wound down, they were left at the table with only Sterling and Beatrix. Sterling had been trying to get Beatrix to dance with him, but she seemed out of sorts. Finally, Davis called across the table, Mr. Marshall, might I ask you to do me a great favor? Sterling looked across at Davis and smiled. Please call me Sterling, and whatever favor I can grant, Dr. Powell, I would be honored. Davis smiled. Well, it's not an earth-shaking request, but Beverly loves to dance and I am temporarily chairbound, so could you dance with her one time as my proxy? Sterling stood and said, I'd be delighted. Beatrix stared daggers at Sterling and reached for the last bottle of wine near the center of the table. Beverly remembered that dance like it was yesterday. She wondered what was wrong with Beatrix that she didn't want to dance with Sterling. When Sterling took her in his arms, she forgot all about Beatrix, and with the wine she had consumed, she let herself go and melted against him as he led her around the dance floor in the darkened ballroom. Sterling was a superb dancer. Whoever taught him did a wonderful job. His lead was almost telepathic, guiding her with just a subtle pressure with a hand on her back or arm or a minor shift of his leg. She had never experienced dancing like this. It was wonderfully erotic. They had been working together for only a short time, but this was the first time since they were teens that she had been in his arms, and the dance was over much too soon. She and Davis said their good nights, and it was not lost on her that Beatrix was rigid with anger when they returned to the table. The memory of that night suddenly caused Beverly to consider that evening more closely. Could it have been that dance that had started Beatrix down the drug-infused path she chose? There was a tension between the 2, but was it Beatrix's jealousy and insecurity over Sterling working each day with Beverly that set the self-destructive course? Beatrix and Beverly had been rivals of a sort many years ago, but the fates had given Beatrix the upper hand and she had ended up with Sterling. Why would she feel threatened? Beverly tried to will the memories away, but without success. They flooded back. Suddenly she was 16 again and in love for the first time, and it was a beautiful Northern California summer before her junior year. Those days with Sterling were magical. He had come out of his shell with her. He explained reluctantly that his previous girlfriend, Beatrix, had dumped him the year before. At the time, Beverly couldn't imagine what was wrong with that girl, but aside from the hurt to Sterling she was grateful, since that left the field open for her. She knew vaguely who the girl was, and then one day at the end of summer just before school started Beverly saw Beatrix come to the Berkeley pool where Sterling was the lifeguard. Beverly took great pleasure in walking up to Sterling and putting her arm through his. Beatrix seemed shocked. It was actually funny because Beatrix seemed to want to be possessive, but Sterling shut her down. It wasn't anything he said, it was his attitude of coolness which let her know there was no more interest on his part. She had dumped him for the glamorous life of a cheerleader and had discovered that he wasn't going to wait for her. Beverly had never told Sterling how satisfied she was to see his ex-girlfriend put in her place. As she showered in preparation for her date with Sterling, Beverly had to admit that her victory that day was a Pyrrhic one, because who ended up married to Sterling? Beatrix, the ex-girlfriend, did, but fate had played a cruel game with Sterling and Beverly, and due to her stupidity they broke up. She had hurt the man she loved, and it took a long time to get over it. Get over it? Actually, at times, especially after Davis's death, she still looked back and wondered, what if? The summer Sterling returned from 4 years in the Marines, Beverly was 21, and was doing a research internship with Dr. Davis Powell, who was her idol. She was a recent college graduate waiting to start medical school in the fall when she was awarded one of Davis's summer internships. He was charismatic and driven and about 10 years her senior. His proposal of marriage swept her off her feet. Beverly sometimes wondered if Sterling had shown up just a few weeks earlier, would she have ended up with him? Regardless, when he did show up he ended up in her lab quite by accident his first day back. She was stunned. When she saw him she was alone in the lab and she clearly remembered carefully setting the liquid filled on the lab bench and ran to him and threw her arms around him. They held each other like long-lost friends, their troubled past behind them. They had both matured greatly. During the few weeks he was on campus they had several lunches together. Davis was always too busy to get away at lunch, so it was a pleasant diversion for her and she learned a very little about where he had been the past 4 years. Mostly they talked about the future, although it was a future without the other. Sterling was excited to start school at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo in the engineering program where he hoped to design and build a new generation of computers. Beverly was excited about starting medical school. Somehow her engagement to Davis was less exciting. At the time it seemed almost a merger of like minds, a business deal. Although over the years their love had grown, and with the birth of Charlotte they seemed to become even closer. Davis had been a remarkable man, a wonderful husband and father, and his death had been a terrible blow. Nevertheless, she had made it very clear to Sterling from the start that she was engaged, and there was no future for them. If Sterling was hurt she thought he hid it well. But again, considering how she had hurt him in the past, that was not surprising. So they had the few weeks before he had to leave for school. They promised friendship and to write, but with the demands of medical school and his college, letters became few. The last she heard from him was a week before she wed, when he sent her a card with a note of congratulations. Somehow that saddened her greatly, but it was too late to turn back the clock. It was not long after that she heard from a friend Sterling had married Beatrix, the ex-girlfriend that Beverly had seen that late summer day at the Berkeley pool while they were in high school. She had wondered what had brought them back together. Of course all would have been different had she not driven Sterling away with her one idiotic act of immature rebellion and stupidity at the Whistler ski resort near Vancouver, Canada over Christmas vacation. She and Sterling had been exclusive for almost 6 months and had sex the first time that day in October she turned 18. Her parents had liked Sterling for the most part, although they thought at 18 she was much too young to get tied down. But Beverly felt she had met the man with whom she would spend her life, and no amount of discussion with her parents would sway her. She had convinced them that Sterling should be invited on their annual ski trip, and she was ecstatic when they finally gave in. That year they were going to the Whistler Resort near Vancouver, Canada. Beverly was over the moon with excitement and of course her teenaged mindset, the expectation bar pretty high. She imagined skiing each day on perfect powder and spending nights wrapped in Sterling's arms. Their vacation started Christmas Day with an afternoon flight to Vancouver. When they picked up Sterling the first part of her dream went awry. He brought his snowboard, not skis, and even though he explained he could rent skis for skiing together he was also excited to teach her to snowboard. That was not the picture Beverly had of their time together, and to Sterling's puzzlement, Beverly was out of sorts much of the flight. Of course, the fact her period started a couple days before didn't help things. Those minor bumps in the road were followed by a blizzard which arrived as they did, and pretty much shut down all outdoor activities. On top of everything else, her parents had arranged for a 2-bedroom suite, which meant that she shared the suite with them and a room with her sister, Emily. Sterling's room was at the other end of the lodge. There was no way she was going to be able to spend nights with Sterling. Her mood was less than rosy. During the weather-imposed isolation, she did get a chance to spend some quiet time with Sterling. They spent time near the giant fireplace in the great hall, reading and sitting close, feeling the warmth of each other. They took all their meals together. She was frustrated by the lack of intimacy imposed by the sleeping arrangements and the fact a parent or her sister always seemed to be around. 2 days after Christmas, the weather turned clear and cold, and the conditions were perfect again on the mountain. She and Sterling got on the slopes early and skied until lunch. At lunch, she was surprised when a group of snowboarders came to the table and started talking with Sterling about snowboarding that afternoon. They left saying they hoped to see him later. What was distressing was a young woman, someone Beverly would describe as full-on goth, who obviously was quite taken with Sterling. "Did you promise to go snowboarding with them this afternoon?" she said snappishly. He looked sheepish. "Well, we did talk about it yesterday. I was going to mention it, and I thought it would be a great time for you to give it a try." "And when were you going to mention this to me?" Sterling looked at her. "I'm sorry. We can just ski this afternoon, and we can snowboard some other day." Unfortunately, Beverly was not to be placated, and she made the first of a series of errors in judgment that would cost her Sterling's love, when she said, "It doesn't really matter. I'm kinda tired. You go ahead." "You sure?" She wanted to scream at him for being so clueless that she was upset and disappointed. Instead, she just shrugged and said, "It's fine." Seething, she watched him head for his room to get his snowboard. This trip just keeps getting better and better. By the time she got back to her empty room, she had convinced herself that Sterling really didn't love her, and he was only snowboarding because he wanted to be with that goth chick. She paced her room fuming. Finally, she lay on her bed and eventually calmed down enough to sleep. Her mother woke her asking if she wanted to join them for dinner. She said she had a headache, so she would pass. Where was Sterling? It was dark and the snow was falling heavily. Probably with his new friend the goth. She fumed. Bored and upset, she looked in the mini-bar thinking some chocolate might boost her spirits. As she pulled out a Cadbury, she spotted the Bailey's Irish Cream among the miniatures. That was kind of chocolate-flavored, and what could it hurt? It was just a little bottle. She didn't bother with a glass and drained the bottle with a couple of gulps. It warmed her insides as she ate the Cadbury. She turned on the TV and channel surfed a bit. By 6, there was still no sign of Sterling, and the next miniature was Drambuie. It was sweet and potent. Beverly had little experience with alcohol other than a sip of beer and an occasional glass of wine at home on a special occasion. Next on the list was a half bottle of red wine. At that point, she thought about the hot tub. She and Sterling had ended up there the last 2 evenings. Beverly wondered if Sterling might be there with his snowboarding buddies. She would go check and maybe catch him in the act. She changed into her smallest 2-piece and put a hotel robe on and grabbed a half bottle of white wine as she left her room. As she walked the hallways, she giggled at her unsteadiness. Soon she was at the hot tub, which was near a large indoor pool located in an atrium with glass walls and ceiling. The snow made it quite beautiful. Instead of Sterling and his snowboarding friends, she found a mixed group of older Canadian kids. They called her and convinced her to join the group in the large tiled hot tub. She ended up between a well-muscled boy and a large-chested red-haired girl. They had all been drinking, and when Beverly sat, the two of them squeezed against her. Beverly let herself relax, and soon she felt hands on her legs caressing her. Soon a hand was brushing her breasts, and she realized her top was undone and her breasts exposed. She opened her eyes to discover she was alone except her 2 companions. She looked toward the girl and went to tell her no, but was silenced by a kiss. Beverly had never been kissed by a girl before, and it was strangely erotic. Soon she felt her bottoms being lowered. She wanted to protest, but with the alcohol and the eroticism, she just couldn't form words even when the girl's lips had moved to her nipples. Beverly moaned as she felt a finger probe her. It seemed like no time before she was panting as the orgasm built, and then it washed over her as the girl next to her mashed her breasts against hers and tongued her mouth. Beverly was in a post-orgasmic dream state when a hand took hers and placed it on the cock of the boy next to her. That's when she heard those terrible words, "Jesus, Beverly, what are you doing?" There was Sterling standing over her with a face full of rage and pain. He reached down and grabbed her arm as she tried to cover her exposed breasts. She hardly resisted as he pulled her up, but then Beverly watched, as if in slow motion, the Canadian boy as he connected a roundhouse right to the side of Sterling's face. That blow knocked him back and turned him part way around so his head hit the tile wall behind the tub with a thud. Stunned, Sterling went to his knees on the tile floor. Beverly screamed, "No, no, no!" She tried to get to him, but she was having problems getting her suite pulled up and finding her top. She watched Sterling shake his head, and she would never forget the look in his eyes and the blood that spattered the tiles from the gash over his eye. He said nothing as he pushed himself up, and unsteadily turned and left. "Sterling! Sterling!" she screamed, but he was beyond hearing her. She pulled up the bottom of her suit with shaky hands and retrieved the top from the floor near the hot tub without bothering to put it back on. She didn't think she was capable of tying it anyway. She covered herself with the hotel robe and left without a backward glance, ashamed and frightened. And then she took the coward's way out. Instead of going to Sterling and helping him and telling him how sorry she was, she fled for her room, rationalizing her actions with the thought that things would be better in the morning. But by then it was much too late. She hardly slept. What could she say to him? How could she make him understand? Early the next morning she arrived at Sterling's room, but only the maid was there, and there was no sign of Sterling or his belongings. In a panic, Beverly asked at the desk. The clerk on duty looked through his papers and said, "Mr. Marshall checked out just before midnight. Where could he have gone?" The snowstorm had unleashed its fury overnight, and none of the night staff could recall if a taxi had been called or what exactly had happened to the tall young American with the bandage over his eye. In her disoriented and panicky state, it was noon before she confessed to her parents that she and Sterling had had a fight and he had left the hotel in the night. Her parents immediately called the marshals to see if he had contacted them. He had not, and by nightfall everyone was quite worried. Beverly feared that Sterling was dead in a snowbank, and they were all relieved when one of the hotel staff said they had spoken to a snowplow driver who had picked up Sterling not far from the hotel and gave him a ride down the mountain. Unfortunately, the driver knew nothing else other than he had dropped Sterling at the main highway about 3 in the morning. The family left the next morning still without word from, or about Sterling. They filed a report with a very solicitous RCMP officer. Beverly had not stopped crying since the morning she discovered Sterling had gone. All her waking hours and her restless sleep were filled with visions of the look on Sterling's bleeding face as he realized her betrayal. For days later, the California Highway Patrol delivered Sterling to his parents' home. He had been picked up at a rest stop on Interstate 5 in Northern California near Red Bluff. He had hitchhiked from Canada and along the way had sold his snowboard so he could buy food. Sterling's mother had interceded on Beverly's behalf and Sterling had agreed to see her. So 2 days after the new year began, she was sitting on a bench in the small park across from the high school in the drizzle, feeling miserable. She had hardly slept or eaten in days and was so overtaken with guilt that she didn't know how much longer she could go on with the pain inside her. When he arrived, there was no smile or reassuring hug. The pain in his eyes probably mirrored her own. She winced as she saw the large purple bruise on his cheek and the line of stitches over his right eye. The bruise that formed there extended almost to his hairline. She motioned for him to sit next to her, but he simply shook his head, standing in front of her wearing an old parka and jeans, the rain dripping from his wet hair. "Sterling, I'm sorry." "Sorry?" she sobbed. He said nothing, but simply gave a slight shrug. "I know. I can't ever take it all back, or pretend it never happened, but I need to tell you I was drunk." His expression didn't change. "I was stupid and jealous of that goth girl, and I was mad, so I started drinking. I went to the hot tube to see if you were there. I should have left, but I got in the tub and... Beverly put her head down and sobbed, the tears mixing with the rain on her face. After a while she looked up. The hurt in his eyes conveyed how she had hurt him. "I'm sorry, so sorry. Will you ever forgive me?" Before he could answer, she blurted, "I just want us back together." For a second he seemed amazed at what she said. He smiled, but it was filled with such sadness it broke her heart. At that moment she knew she had lost him. It was as if an icy fist had wrapped itself around her heart. Finally Sterling spoke. "I'm sorry too, Beverly. I thought we had something special. I was wrong." She flinched as if struck when he said those words. "We need some time apart, some time for each of us to come to terms with what happened and to go on with our lives. I loved you with all my heart, and inside I probably always will, but I'm tired of loving and being hurt. I don't think I can ever take the chance again." She could say nothing as her throat was so constricted. "Goodbye, Beverly. I hope you find love and happiness." He turned and walked away, and she finally found her voice. "Sterling, I'll love you forever," she called out. He stopped and turned. "Love never lasts." Those were the last words she heard from Sterling until he came back from the Marines over 4.5 years later. Beverly shook herself, the memories suddenly so very sharp. Working with Sterling over the last 3 years, she had to face those memories, but Davis was dying and Sterling was her support, her married support. Then Beatrix betrayed him. Now they were going out on a date initiated by Beverly. He had been hurt badly by the 2 women he had loved the most. Why should he be interested in re-establishing a relationship with her? Sterling was handsome, brilliant, and a nice person. Certainly any number of women who had no history with Sterling would be very happy to spend their lives making him happy. She had seen the faces of the women at the medical center as they flocked around. Beverly finished her preparations and suddenly she was insecure. Looking at herself in the oval mirror, even in the sexy black dress and heels, she saw only a wife and mother and scientist instead of a beautiful blonde woman. What could she offer him? Her feelings had grown to the point she had left herself vulnerable. What if he only wanted to continue as friends? Beverly admitted that was not what she wanted. She wanted to spend the rest of her life with him and for him to love her. The same thing that younger version of Beverly had wanted. Beverly also knew Sterling would be a wonderful stepfather for Charlotte and would care for her as if she was his own. She felt out of her depth. She couldn't resolve this situation with a scientific formula. There was no textbook explanation for how love works. But the wheel of fate had turned and she realized that this was an opportunity for her to win Sterling. She finished her makeup and grabbed her clutch and made for the living room, determined to show Sterling how much she loved him and that she was worthy of his love, and that love does last. Just then she heard the door chime. Her heart fluttered. Epilogue. I sat and watched the tops of the clouds grow orange and pink as the sun came up behind the Gulfstream G650 business jet as we cruised above 50,000 feet. I turned from the window and smiled at the sleeping form in the large horizontal sleeper seat next to me. She was so bundled in the blankets I could only make out her shape. I didn't need to see her to know she was beautiful and she loved me. I was a lucky man. The new Gulfstream belonged to Mr. Lee Chung, a billionaire and longtime client. My sleeping companion and I were the only passengers, and we were bound for Singapore, where Lee would meet us and the new $47 million addition to his jet fleet. When Lee found out I was heading his way, he graciously offered us a ride on the delivery flight. The beautiful blue and white aircraft had flown from the factory in Savannah, Georgia, and stopped for us in San Francisco. It could fly non-stop to Singapore from California, and it had every luxury amenity, and a delivery crew of 4. This was part business trip, but mostly a honeymoon. It was also a new beginning for the 2 of us. From Singapore we would go on to Australia and New Zealand for a month and then make our way back across the Pacific via Fiji and Tahiti and Hawaii. I wanted nothing more than to make her as happy as she made me. It had been almost 2 years since the disastrous day I had returned from my trip to Taipei to discover my ex-wife was an alcoholic and very close to being addicted to cocaine. And worse, her mental state had declined to the point that she was bent on suicide. Her alcohol addiction and her mental illness, and that was what it was, caused her to fall prey to an unscrupulous partner at her law firm. During those days my life and Beatrix's life had been turned upside down, and I was on an emotional roller coaster. I hated Beatrix and I loved Beatrix. I was also nagged by guilt for not doing more to get her into treatment. She had resisted all my attempts to even discuss it, and of course as our marriage spiraled downward the hostility and absence of real affection took its toll. I consider myself a smart guy, but when you are in a failing relationship it chips away at your soul, and soon you find yourself trying not to care or simply deluding yourself that the other person will one day miraculously return to the loving, caring person you used to be married to. With Beatrix that was not to be. I knew something was wrong, but recognizing the fact that she was clinically depressed was beyond me. And the fact that she was finding solace in alcohol, drugs and risky sexual behavior was beyond anything I could imagine. On top of that, I discovered afterwards that Beatrix had become incredibly jealous of my work with Beverly Powell. She had never forgotten that I had been in love with Beverly many years before, and she was with me. In her deluded mental state, Beatrix had convinced herself we were having an affair. Fortunately, Beatrix made a rapid physical recovery. Her mental state took longer, and it was difficult for me to help her. Of course, I made sure she had the best medical care and paid for her stay at the Redwood, but emotionally I was unable or unwilling to muster the courage to do all the things her therapist recommended. For a while I could hardly stand to be in the same room with her for any length of time. Had I not witnessed her self-destructive meltdown that Sunday morning, my wife dressed like a hooker, and heard the phone calls from her coworkers and seen the drugs, I might have been able to join her, as she requested, for those months of therapy. But those images were burnt into my brain, and the hurt I had suffered while she caused our marriage to disintegrate meant that for a long time I couldn't face her. Her betrayal was certainly the abandonment I had subconsciously feared all these years, since she threw me over for what I considered a frivolous quest in high school. During the time of Beatrix's destructive behavior, I became a hard man, or I should say returned to being a hard man. My marriage to Beatrix and the raising of our children had mellowed me and taken the edge off, but the hardness I had picked up in the Marines always lurked under the surface. I had learned to kill and had become a master at it from long and short range. As I left the Corps, a shrink told me that my problem wasn't that I enjoyed killing and felt no remorse, but the fact I felt nothing at all. The old Marine Corps saying that, "The only thing I feel when I kill is recoil," pretty much summed it up. It was my job and I did it well. So I arranged to have Cole Harvey killed for abusing my wife and Mark Lamont beaten. Mark was damned lucky, and the only reason he was spared was that he had a family. That rainy Sunday, while Beatrix was unconscious, I had easily accessed the law firm's downtown San Francisco offices. The electronic tools provided by Eric allowed me to move about unobserved and undisturbed. In Cole's office, I uncovered a pharmacy of illegal drugs, and on his computer the photos that were used to blackmail Beatrix and other members of the firm, especially a number of young female employees. He really was a piece of work, and the world became a better place without his slimy presence. His computer also showed me how the corruption permeated the highest levels of the firm. I downloaded all his files, then destroyed his computer with a doomsday virus. A less virulent but persistent virus took down the office network, but not before I got access to it. The fact that the law firm had no computer access for a couple of weeks was very hard on its bottom line. It does help to have friends in high and low places, and my anonymous tip was quickly corroborated by Beatrix, and some of the young victims, and search warrants were quickly served. The large amount of cocaine found in Cole's office opened up the can of worms that included his dealings with the East Bay drug gangs, and he was hung out to dry, as was the law firm. Of course, the amounts of recreational drugs found at the firm during the searches implicated a lot of people, and there was no shortage of employees who were willing to testify. I knew once all the information got out about drug use and trading cocaine for sex and the coercive tactics that were being used on some of the younger female staff, the firm would certainly not survive, at least in its present prestigious form. Of course, I was a suspect, maybe not a prime suspect, but a suspect nonetheless when Cole disappeared. He had plenty of people looking for him, upset about his testimony before a grand jury and worried about what he might further disclose. Lots of bad people wanted him to disappear. I wanted to do the job myself, but Steve talked me out of it, and when Cole went missing I was on a plane to Seoul. No details were provided, but I fantasized that pieces of his body now made up part of the foundation of the new Trans Bay terminal. Actually, he probably ended up dumped in the Pacific many miles offshore. Yes, the world was a better place without him. That pesky FBI guy, Special Agent George, seemed to have decided I was the primary suspect despite the fact I had a rock-solid alibi. The first time we met, he appeared at my door, just to talk. I told him I hardly knew Harvey, but if he was dead and buried I would not mourn his passing, or that of any member of the firm. I wished them all a speedy transit to hell. The next interview was at the FBI office, and this time I brought my attorney. George had subpoenaed all my financial records, probably looking for a payout to a hitman or perhaps just looking for dirt. I also knew those records would be going to the IRS and that I could look forward to years of audits. I considered it a small price to pay for the vengeance, but still I had hired Beatrix's new boss, Celia Kennedy. Celia was a very attractive 40-something, but hard as nails and a tough defense attorney who made it clear to the FBI that I had already provided a statement and all my records, and unless they were going to charge me, to stop the harassment. I liked her. I also liked the fact she never asked me about my relationship with her employee, Beatrix. I knew Celia's ex, Sterling Kennedy. He was a client. I had won the contract when his PI firm upgraded all their systems, plus their maintenance contract. It wasn't a big job, but I thought it was important. I didn't know what split them up, but I did know Sterling's business partner was his new wife, and she was a knockout, and he'd started a new family with her. It was our kids who brought Beatrix and I back together in the months after the divorce was final. Of course, we had to get together for the big things like Connie's college graduation. Then there were dinner out nights when Brady was home from school. Most times he would stay with me at my condo in San Francisco, and since Beatrix worked only a few blocks away, it was logical to invite her along for dinner. Connie made a point of taking the BART over from Berkeley. During nice weather, the four of us would sit at an outside table at one of the restaurants along the Embarcadero or at the ferry building. Sometimes we would stroll the Embarcadero after dinner, and I would have Beatrix and Connie on my arms. We looked like a happy family. These dinners became a weekly event, and I found myself looking forward to them. Over the months, Brady had begun to warm to his mother. Of course, he never knew about the sex and drugs. He just bought into the mental illness, and their relationship reestablished itself over a year or so. At first, he was pretty gun-shy around his mother, afraid she might revert to the harridan he had experienced in high school. But soon things were pretty much back to normal. Of course, with him at college, his attention was being focused elsewhere. I knew he was puzzled why I made little effort to get us back together. I think he figured after the hurt I'd suffered it would take longer, but that I would eventually come around. With our daughter Connie, well, I never knew what Beatrix told her about our breakup. She continued to live in the house in El Cerrito with her mother while she was in law school. The times she and I would get together, she would just quiz me about how I was doing and not broach the subject of getting back together with Beatrix. I think she knew the truth, but it was obvious that she wanted it to happen. During those days it seemed like I was going to be outvoted and that eventually Beatrix and I would reconcile. The memories of that horrible Sunday had started to fade, and Beatrix made it very clear that if we got back together the relationship would change, and she would never again lose sight of what our relationship was about. One weather-perfect evening the four of us were at an outdoor cafe, and Connie and I had split a bottle of wine Brady had joined in too, sipping from his sister's glass, and was feeling pretty relaxed with the evening sun on the bay and a light breeze. Beatrix, of course, was not drinking, but she was also relaxed and seemingly happy. When Connie asked, "Dad, Mom once said you two split up in high school and then got back together after you started college, but she didn't tell me how you got back together." Suddenly Connie looked embarrassed, perhaps thinking she had tread on sensitive grounds. Beatrix looked sad for a moment, and before I could answer she said, "We didn't split up. I broke up with your father because I thought cheerleading was more important. Once I realized I was mistaken, he had moved on and then disappeared into the Marines for 4 years." Her statement got Brady's attention. He, like Connie, had never heard anything but the sanitized version with the two of us growing up together, falling in love and getting married when I was in college. He blurted, "So what happened?" Beatrix smiled, but there was sadness behind her eyes as she said, "Oh, I was a determined woman, and when I found out your father was starting at Cal Poly the fall after I graduated from Cal, well, I applied for a job at Poly and ended up working in the admissions office." I smiled and took up the story. "I remember the day I first saw your mother at Poly. It was a beautiful late summer day, and I stood in the endless lines for class assignments, student identifications and such, feeling very old for being a freshman at almost 23. These days I'm sure all those things are handled online. There's probably a Cal Poly app that just allows you to register on your phone." I laughed. Of course, my time in the Marines had not improved my social skills or lack thereof. Plus, after the Marines, I really hated to stand in lines. They all laughed, having heard my story numerous times about the drill instructor who tells a recently graduated private that he knows the private hates him and that the private will probably come to piss on his grave one day. The private replied, "One thing I learned in 12 weeks in the Marines is I hate to stand in lines." So I was pretty much keeping to myself and just watching the vast display of immaturity all around me. "Oh, it wasn't that bad. Even nerds get to let loose once in a while," Beatrix chimed in. Everyone laughed, knowing well Cal Poly's reputation as a school for brainy kids. As I was saying, Instead of joining in the general frivolity of that day, I just watched, thinking about how old I felt and wondering how I was going to fit in. I was surprised when I got to the end of one interminable line to discover your mother sitting at the registration table. She was helping out, and while I was getting some important piece of my registration taken care of that day, she asked me out, and the rest is history. Actually, I think it was your parking permit, Beatrix replied with a straight face. See, I told you it was important. I winked at Connie and Brady, who chuckled dutifully. This kind of good-humored banter pretty much summed up our evenings, but there was never a time when Beatrix and I went out alone. We just slipped into the family mode when the kids were around. A number of times Brady and Connie left us alone after dinner and I walked Beatrix to the BART. I was sure she wanted me to ask her out and she was too uncertain to ask me. We had come a long way from our days at Cal Poly. But I was in a quandary. I was in love with two women. Over the past 3 years I had worked with Beverly Powell, and those years had coincided with tragedy in our lives, and as we supported each other through the hard times we were drawn closer. As my marriage disintegrated, even before Beatrix tried to take her life, I found I was being drawn to Beverly. Beatrix's fears that working with Beverly would rekindle an old love proved correct, but it was Beatrix who provided the match and the kindling for the fire. Of course I was afraid to say anything to Beverly, not wanting to jeopardize the friendship I valued so greatly. As the project at the medical center wound down, the thought of not seeing Beverly almost every day was unbearable. As a single I was in a rut. I worked and then went home to my condo. I would see Beatrix and Connie and Brady almost every week and found I enjoyed those times more and more as memories faded and habits built over 20 years reasserted themselves. Was that enough? Most days I felt as if I was being torn apart. I wanted my family back together and missed the loving wife I had for those years. But I also had been deeply hurt and was drawn to Beverly, who had suffered tragedies of her own. Those things that attracted me to Beverly years ago were still much in evidence. From her warm smile and natural Scandinavian beauty to her quick wit and intelligence. Yes, she had hurt me, but that incident had happened so long ago that it was best forgotten. Looking back on it, I saw with the clarity of hindsight two teens who were well-matched but immature. We had not communicated well, and each had different expectations on that Canada trip. The result was disaster. She had gotten drunk and had been taken advantage of by two older teens. I had overreacted, and what should have been a spat turned into a breakup. Stupidity and my pride reigned supreme, and I lost her. In my years in the Marines, as I developed the patience of the sniper's craft, I had lots of time to reflect on those times with Beverly, and as I matured, the anger I felt was replaced by anger at myself. Many times when I was away, I thought of writing to her, but I was convinced I had hurt her so badly she'd forgotten me, or at least never wanted to see me again. When I had returned from the Marines and met her by accident at Berkeley, she had hugged me and cried, but it was too late. Those few weeks at the end of that summer, when the soft light of summer in Northern California made everything seem unreal, those were the days I remembered with Beverly. I could not tell her then that I still loved her. We picnicked on campus and caught up in the shade of the trees on the lawns. She never knew what I did in the Marines because I only spoke of the funny things and the parts of military life that are ruled by the absurd. In the end, after just a few weeks, I wished her well and let her go, and started the next phase of my life as a student at Cal Poly. Was I on the rebound when Beatrix inexplicably moved back into my life at school? Perhaps, but there was a pre-existing bond there too. I was mature enough at the time to realize that there was no sense in living with regret with memories of Beverly when I had Beatrix who loved me and who made it very clear she had made a mistake all those years ago. The bond we had reestablished itself and my love for her resurfaced. Today we were bound by the memories and the experiences of raising two children and many years of happy marriage. Could I let Beverly go again? Should I? Were happy memories and raising two children together enough to reestablish a marriage that had been torn apart by the actions of one? Did I want to risk it with Beatrix? These questions and the guilt I felt about not stopping Beatrix as she went down her self-destructive path gnawed at me. Then one day, as we were wrapped up one of the final meetings at the medical center after the project was completed, Beverly asked me to dinner. I was nervous. Did she know how I felt? Did she feel the same about me? We had shared tragedy and worked shoulder to shoulder for almost 3 years through design, installation, testing, and application. We had fought bureaucracy together and were justified in the feelings of pride we had in bringing this project to fruition. I arrived at her home in the Palisades, flowers in hand, not knowing what to expect. I was given a smile and a once-over by her daughter Charlotte, who looked so much like her mother at 16 I had to smile. And then Beverly came out wearing a black dress that practically stopped my heart. And when I opened the car door for her, she stepped close enough that I could smell her perfume and said, "I hope this evening includes dancing." As the sunshine began to fill the cabin of the Gulfstream, I turned back from the window and saw her watching me, her hair tousled and looking sleepy-eyed. I leaned over to her seat and kissed her. She smiled and whispered, "I love you, Sterling, and I will forever," as she stretched out her arms to me. I let her arms enfold me and I replied, "I love you too, Beverly."